works really well. However, we do need to keep this idea in mind that it could be real or imagined. Adam, I see you've managed to join us. I don't know what your thoughts are on this.
First of all, can you hear me okay?
Yep, can hear you fine.
Excellent. So can you do that? Sorry, I'm getting a little bit of feedback. How do I stop that?
You don't need to mute for just now.
Yeah, that's really really strange there. Let me go back onto Club Deck. Yeah, I mean, my thoughts are, can hypnosis heal your inner child? Well, first of all, what really is the inner child? And I think most hypnotists that have, a couple of years experience are going to have that experience of doing some inner child work, either deliberately or just by accident. And sometimes going to a point in the past, as we know, going to the point of inception or the point of a sensitizing event, quite often a lot of these things happen in childhood. And sometimes by resolving an issue or looking at a trauma in a new way, we accidentally do inner child work and realize that it's very powerful. So I think the element of inner child work, most hypnotherapists that I speak to realize that it is a very powerful, very effective way of doing therapy. And there's very different ways of doing it. So lots of different things that we can talk about here. Does it actually heal? In the sense that, are we saying that the inner child is injured? Because at some level, this is all just a metaphor. And how best do we do it? For those people listening, if you know anyone that actually does inner child work and works with people's inner child, please add the little plus button, ping a few people into the room. Be great to get their thoughts. Really what we want is examples, anecdotes of you using different ways of helping or dealing with the inner child. What results have you seen when you've done inner child work? Feel free to raise your hand, either ask us a question or just share what you're doing in that way. And yeah, the more of a conversation we can make this, the better it is, I think, for everyone. Rowan, how long, or let me ask a different question. When was the first ever time you did inner child work with someone? What was that like to kind of venture down that path?
Actually, this is where I started. So I first off started with a technique called matrix reprinting, which is a sort of modification of EFT level 3 to work with this timeline idea as well. And one of the first people I worked with was a woman who had abuse in her teenage years from one of her friends who'd effectively raped her. And she couldn't talk about the event when we went through it. And going through it, she had an abreaction halfway through the session. I had the guy that was doing the training, Carl Dawson, standing over me, watching me and making sure I was working with her safely and effectively. And this is during the actual training. So it was quite a sort of daunting experience for me. I'd done basic hypnosis training, but this was the first sort of more advanced training where I was actually getting to work on real problems during the training. And she came out of the experience looking back and seeing that this moment in her life was one of the driving forces that made her into this powerful, strong businesswoman that was not scared of anything and able to do anything with her life. And she'd gone on to build her own companies and amass an empire effectively. And she stood up in front of the whole seminar afterwards and told us all what had happened with this individual. And she could see him for being weak and all this aspect of it. So it was a really powerful moment in my life where I could see just how powerful working with these inner child and early years experiences can be for shifting beliefs and changing personality and allowing us to give ourselves credit for some of the things that we've been able to achieve as a result of going through and surviving these sort of experiences in our life. So it's been sort of a big part of my practice ever since then. And that's back in 2012, I think it was, that I did that training. So it's been quite a while. What about yourself?
Yeah, I think for me, it was how I was taught to do inner child was to almost like treat it like a part, of the subconscious mind, to introduce that part And how I did it in the early days was create some kind of child-friendly environment, normally a garden or a park, and say very, very shortly, a child that is a representation of your inner child will enter. But prefacing that by saying, look, don't worry about the age, don't worry about even the gender. This is just a representation of what your inner child is. So if it's, if you're female and it's male, don't worry about that. This is all in the pre-talk. And found it like really useful, even though I was kind of figuring it out as I went along. The way in which I did it is to enable them to kind of slowly build rapport with each other, and pacing them to say, well, look, tell me, and saying, look, you can talk even in hypnosis, but what's their facial expressions like? What's their body language like? And more often than not, there was a poor relationship with that perceived inner child. The inner child was at some level neglected or felt, kind of not really valid, and that kind of point. And then effectively, it's almost like this little reunion would take place where they would get to know their inner child again. They would actually talk to them, learn about them, and I liked the kind of the language of kind of play and the kind of things that are really important to children. So I'll say, right, and at some level, I want you to share a secret with this child. And, anyone that has children know that children love that kind of the bond that comes from sharing a secret and that kind of stuff. But by sharing the secret first, it then triggers the law of reciprocity. So then, of course, the child then wants to share a secret, but they're really getting an insight from, at some level, some kind of unresolved issue from their childhood. And the other thing that I did in the early days, which I still do now, which I think is really beneficial, is this exchanging of gifts. And I would say, and it's always the adult that gives it first, but I said, right, I want you to think of a resource or belief that would be really valuable for this child now that you know their circumstances. And that might be confidence or self-belief or something like that. And then, naturally, law of reciprocity, the child then has something to give back. And more often than not, what I find is that, adults, as much as they're wiser and more experienced, have lost something that they had when they were a child. That might be playfulness, imagination, creativity. But 99 times out of 100, whenever I do inner child work, they've missed something that they used to have before. So this kind of exchange, the adult probably has the wisdom and the perspective and the confidence of knowing the future. And they can say to that child, look, things are going to get better. Just have faith, just have confidence that things are going to work out okay to reduce the stress. But equally, more often than not, the child will give the adult the ability to play again or smile or not take life so seriously, or mindfulness. Children naturally are mindful. So that element of an exchange of gifts, but not physical gifts, but a resource. That was my early experiences of inner child work. And, more often than not, it creates a mild abreaction, sometimes a severe abreaction, but, quite often when I do inner child work, there is tears. It's a profound experience that they're going through, because effectively they're reconnecting with a part of themselves that they've lost at some level. So I find it like a really magical experience. I love doing it inner child work. How I do it slightly different now is less of this element of, metaphor, that something representing your inner child. And I'll say, look, normally in the pre-talk, when did this issue start? Or when were these beliefs formed? And they'll say, I would hear my parents arguing and that kind of stuff. So then I would say, right, I want you to go back, disassociated, see yourself as a child, and then, tell them the stuff that you never got to hear at that point. Listen to them about their concerns and their worries. So it is inner child work, but it's with now a memory of their earlier self rather than a representation of an inner child. So I think it's naturally evolved that way for me. But I'm really keen to listen to, like, anyone in the audience, like, what's your experiences of doing inner child work? How do you do it? Why do you do it? What results have you seen? So raise your hand if you've got something there that you'd like to, kind of share, anything related to inner child stuff. Do you think it's all just made up? I mean, I kind of do. As much as I love doing inner child work, I kind of feel like this is all just a made up representation. But my approach is, if the metaphor works, if the model works, if it helps create results, then who cares if it's made up? You know, that's the most important thing. Steve, welcome up on the stage.
Good evening. How you doing?
Very good indeed, Steve.
Hi, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Jolly good. Well, as Melissa's here always says, all this shit's made up. And when I don't do inner child work specifically, but I think there's elements of inner child work in things like timeline, and the principle I think is common across all these methodologies. We're sending them back with the resources and knowledge they have as an adults to visit their younger self and to walk their younger self through certain troubles or trials they've had, and maybe give their younger self a hug and tell their younger self all the things they really need to hear. And sometimes I'll add a bit in, is there anything that your younger self wants to say to you in the privacy of your own mind? And I had one guy the other day, actually, he spent 15 minutes listening to what his younger self had to say. I was beginning to think he'd gone to sleep, but he hadn't. He was working away. They could see his eyelids going. It was quite incredible. So I think it's fascinating work, but all these things, whether we say inner child work or timeline work, and some of the stuff by David Snyder is really good, because he'll take people right back to the, to the point of conception effectively, and so they can arm their embryonic self with a shield and a sword and a magic talisman and this sort of thing. I see a lot of commonality across all these methodologies.
I really like that. I think, and as you were saying that, give yourself a hug. I think that tactile element is such an important part of reconnecting, with the part that represents, perhaps a wounded or kind of upset or damaged kind of part. I use the phrase, I want to, say hello and say goodbye with your inner child in whichever way feels most comfortable. It could be a handshake, could be a hug, could just be a smile, high five, but whatever it is for you. And more often than not, they say it was a hug, because I think there is that kind of element of, connection that you get from a hug that you don't get in kind of other ways of greeting. But yeah, that kind of element, I love the symbolism there of, kind of shields and kind of armory and that kind of stuff. I think is fantastic. Rowan, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I do when I'm working with timeline stuff is I get them to introduce themselves to their younger self and let them know that everything's okay, that they're there from the future, that everything's fine, but they're about to look at something that may be a little bit difficult. And I get them to walk through it with their younger self, and that keeps them in that disassociated observer position. But I think one of the things that sort of comes up with me is this idea of, like what Steve says there about creating this shield and using that there's a presupposition there that you're going to have to use a shield. You need a shield, and you don't necessarily. So in those presuppositions of the language that we use as therapists, we can actually cause more trauma than we're clearing if we're not careful. So I think that this sort of avenue of working with any previous timeline stuff, in my opinion, all beliefs they're like branches of a tree that go back to more generalized beliefs when we're younger, and they get more complex, and sort of new beliefs get pegged on as we get older and older. So quite often you'll find that the actual start of a belief will be something in those imprinting years of sort of 3 to 9. And that's where we create these really generalized beliefs like it's dangerous outside. And then maybe in our 20s, we have some accident outside and we get agoraphobia, and we think that it's because of something in our 20s, when it's actually pegged onto this earlier belief that's completely wrong. So when we're going back to that sort of level and changing beliefs back that far, we have a real danger of we can do massive change for healing the inner child, but we can also traumatize the individual and create new beliefs that don't serve them if we're not careful. So I think we have to be careful with the presuppositions in our language in what's not said, as well as what we say. But I do think it's wonderfully powerful to be able to allow someone to go there. In my pre-talk, I tend to go for the idea that your entire universe that you experience Everything you've ever seen, everything you've ever touched, everything you've ever smelled, heard, tasted, it's all in your mind. It's all sensory information that goes in through the sense organs and then it's transferred into electrical signals and rebuilt in your brain. So you've never actually experienced the outside world. You've never experienced anything out there. So from that perspective, we can love everything that happens within our universe as being part of ourselves and look at it in ways that allow us to reframe it in a way where we can get a benefit out of it rather than have it hurting us. I don't know if, does that make sense?
It totally makes sense. Yeah. I mean, what effectively you're doing is you're saying that, you know, because every kind of memory is the same as kind of the original experience, it's an internal representation. Therefore, you know, we've got the ability to kind of have that work for us rather than against us.
Yeah.
In terms of that element of, you know, a presupposition that you're going to need a shield. If I know in the pre-talk that someone has had a really tough, I mean, I worked with a lady last week who alcoholic, mother, you know, father, you know, truck driver on the roads all the time. She was neglected. And I did some, you know, kind of inner child / timeline work with her. And I said, like, I want you to go back to the child, you know, at a happy memory, you know, before all this crap happens, and knowing what you now know about your childhood and all the tough times. I want you to give that child knowledge, wisdom as advice, knowing that it is going to be a tough childhood that enables them to handle that better. And I think that element, then you're not having this kind of naive saying, well, none of this bad stuff's going to happen. You're going to be wrapped in a kind of blanket here. But that if you knew then what you now know, how could you have handled things in a better way? And I think giving that resource to an inner child, that changes a lot, because effectively you're helping them build a resourceful state and saying, look, it's going to be shitty. It's going to be tough, but you can handle it, you know, rather than feeling that they're broken in adulthood because of that, if that makes any sense at all.
Yeah, I think that transfer of resources and knowledge from the adult version of them in the memory to the younger version, wherever it happens to be in the timeline, is a really important part of the start, the first steps of working with any memory, whether it's real or imagined. So yeah, I think that's a massive part of it.
Willie, welcome.
Can I just pick up on something that Rowan said just then, because I think it's a very, very important point.
Go for it.
That is not to presuppose what those gifts should be. I did actually mention that's one thing I've seen with David Snyder do, but I think he had some knowledge of the case in that particular one. I just suggest to them, you know, the idea of giving their younger self 3 gifts. I don't give a suggestion to what those gifts might be, because, as Rowan so rightly said, that could risk setting them up for, you know, some sort of unsuspected traumas, or maybe something they haven't realised before. And I think that point just needs to be underlined there.
Yeah, definitely. I do something very similar. I just let them transfer any knowledge and information like a mist from the adult self to the younger self, and see that knowledge and information passing over and giving that child whatever it needs to deal with this situation that we're about to look at, and work with that sort of idea. So yeah, I think you're right there, Steve. Needs to be very clean language in that respect. Willie, you're up on stage. Welcome to the room.
How y'all doing today, fellas?
Not too bad, yourself.
Cool. I also want to say my first ever training when I first started hypnosis, we started as far as inner child work, or we started in what age regression. And in age regression, I found after doing that for a while that like Ronan was saying, and you other guys and everybody else was saying that I quit trying to guide the person as to what they say to the child. You know, I just started like everybody else was saying, have that person say what they feel that they need to say to the child to get them through things. And I find that worked a hell of a lot better than than me trying to guide and put my opinion in place where it had no place, more or less.
Yeah, exactly, Willie. I think your point's really good there. What we need to be doing if we're doing this sort of work is we need to be being the guide, but not giving them any suggestions as to what they should do with the memory. You know, if they want to make any changes, if they want to speak anyone else that was involved in the incident, whatever it happens to be, when we're working through that, we need to shut up and let them do the work. And this is a process that should be and can be done completely blind by the therapist. We don't need to know what the memory is. We don't need to know what's happening in that memory or what they're getting back from the other people involved in the memory or anything like that. And we can just sit back and give them instructions and check that they're doing what we're suggesting that they do in form of instructions, but leave the content up to them. I don't know what your thoughts are on this, Adam.
Totally, yeah. We want to make it so that, using very kind of broad language. So the kind of phrases I would use is say, right, whatever resource or belief they need most right now, well, that's for them to decide, you know. And sometimes if I can see them kind of thinking, you know, I might suggest possibilities. Maybe they need confidence, maybe they need self-worth, maybe they need self-belief, maybe they need resilience, but you know, your intuition will guide you as to what they need most. So you want to kind of have it come from them, because that way, you know, particularly because all the sessions I do with clients is recorded. So what I tend to do is I say, well, look, you gave your inner child what it needed most right now, and they gave you whatever they thought you needed most right now. But if you listen to this in 3 weeks' time, you might end up giving yourself entirely different and receiving entirely different gifts, because you're now different than the version of you that kind of had that session. So I think that's, you know, quite a broad way of doing it. But Willie, I think you're absolutely right. You know, it's a case of you can't project. And I think some therapists are probably guilty of, you know, being positively intentioned, thinking they know best, but kind of projecting maybe their childhood onto, you know, their client's childhood, or their ideas about what they would do now to them. And that's not actually that helpful, because, you know, that's just making, you know, them more dependent on an external resource rather than enabling them to feel resourceful intrinsically, which is actually going to enable them to be, you know, in a good place wherever they might end up. And the reality is, you know, we don't really know. What percentage of your therapy, Willie, would you say is inner child stuff? Would you say it's like 10%, 50%? How much of what you do tends to involve inner child?
I want to say maybe about 40 at the most. I don't tend to do a lot of inner child work. I basically work with a lot of stuff with just, you know, content-free detox and stuff like that. And whenever I do go back to work with the little one or the younger version of them, you know, it's just very briefly, and it's just to go back to, like you said, offer them information, give them wisdom, or to go back and just hug that younger them, you know, and reconnect their inner child at the moment. Then I just bring them back to where they're at, you know. I stay out of that zone. I try to stay out of that zone as much as possible.
Yeah, I mean, 40% still, you know, really a lot there, Willie. But I think you're right. Yeah, the content-free stuff is really good, and sometimes, like, once you know how powerful inner child work is, you don't need to spend a lot of time. You know, it can be a relatively small amount of an entire session, but still going in there. I remember working with a client that was a hoarder. You know, she would effectively, and it was kind of obvious, you know, in hindsight, her hoarding all this kind of stuff in her home was to create a barrier to keep people out. She was sexually assaulted when she was, you know, a child, not even a teenager. And, you know, for her, she would keep people at distance, you know, from that. So, you know, effectively, and I love using movie metaphors. A lot of people that follow my podcast will probably know that from the way that I kind of fuse them in. But her favorite TV show was Star Trek. And I love that because it had the ability to kind of use the beaming element to kind of take her to a point in time. So her future self that knew how her life turned out was able to beam down to the child and basically say, look, this thing has happened, but here's how you're going to have it work for you rather than against you. And one of the other things that I tend to do in inner child work is allow the future self to almost be like a guardian angel. Now, I certainly don't believe in guardian angels and that kind of stuff, but within the imagination, I think it's quite comforting for people to believe that they are protected, they are looked after. And given that we're just talking about memories anyway, isn't it nice to think that throughout your whole childhood years, your future self was kind of looking out for you? That's not a bad metaphor to kind of give people that feeling of safety or security. Yeah, I don't know what your thoughts are on that one, Rowan.
Yeah, I mean, the guardian angel thing, my personal opinion on that is that everyone has a copy of all of these different archetypes within their unconscious mind. I don't think there's something out with us, but I do think they are real. If there's any possibility that the individual believes in them, then yes, let them work with it. It's the same sort of idea as, if someone comes to you wanting an exorcism, you give them an exorcism because that's their belief system. If they want some witch doctoring, you give them some witch doctoring. I think this idea of sort of connecting to the inner child, one of the things that I sort of see this as is, when we're children, we start to develop the mask to protect ourselves and protect our vulnerability from the world. And we create this persona that can then shift and change with the different people that we interact with in our daily lives. So maybe you have a slightly different mask that you wear with your friends or your work colleagues or your lover or your parents or whatever it happens to be. And the more we can heal that, those wounds that are creating that mask, the more the mask starts to disintegrate and we start to just be allowed to be ourselves. And one of the things that I've done with a few clients is actually take them to a time in their future where they've fully connected to that inner child and fully removed their mask and look back and see what it is that they have to change to get there now. And that can also be a really powerful way of effectively creating a smart goal for the reintegration of their personality fully. So I think, it doesn't really matter whether we're working back in time or forward in time. We can still call on that inner child and work with it to gain these insights and connections and shifts within the personality. Steve, you're back up on stage.
Hi there. Just wanted to pick up on what you were saying, Rowan, about archetypes. And there's a part of Carl Smith's it's an adjunct to his emotional detox of this idea of this white light. And as they're releasing any of the negative images, feelings, thoughts, emotions, or sensations, they're going up into this white light. And I sort of add in this idea, this white light that you sense has always been there throughout your life and has always been there to look out for you. And I had one client a few weeks ago, profoundly religious. And I just framed it exactly like that, just like a white light that's relieving them of all of these things. And then afterwards, in the post-talk, she was saying, well, yeah, you were telling me to release all this to Jesus. Now, I never used the word Jesus. That was just her interpretation of that archetype, which I thought was quite interesting.
Yeah, I think it is quite interesting, the connections that people make, and the false memories they have after a session as well. This is sort of indicative of how easy it is to create these false memories. If she's there believing that you said to release this to Jesus when it was actually just a white light you were talking to. I do think that purity of that white light that does seem to appear and you can work with is a really interesting aspect of the mind, because it does seem to be effectively the sort of the pure archetype behind all the other archetypes, if that makes sense. Certainly in my mind it is.
Yeah, it's almost like it's a higher ego state in some respects, but people will put their own interpretation on it. I think we're just giving them the framework with this, and that's when their imagination takes over and they start processing things in their way.
Exactly, yeah. It's an interesting one to work with. Have you got anything on that, Adam?
Yeah, I was just saying it's interesting. This is what I like about hypnosis is how much the client brings to the experience, that no matter how broad you make the suggestions, they're filling in the gaps with their own experience, their own nuances, and that really, adds to it. A variation of kind of inner child / timeline work that I kind of I think I came up with it, but because it was inspired by a movie. Like Chris Nolan is my favorite director. For those that don't know, made films like The Dark Knight and Inception and things like that. But his most recent movie was a movie called Tenet. And the principle there is that you've got this element of people moving forwards in time, but also backwards in time. And one of the key elements that makes the movie quite interesting from an action movie point of view is this phrase, the temporal pincer movement, where basically the past and the future are meeting at a single point in time. And I've done some kind of timeline therapy on a few people using this temporal pincer movement, where effectively the younger version of them, which is all kind of before the thing has happened, they're bringing some resources to that moment. And then the future self that knows how things pan out, they're going to that moment. So effectively, there are three versions of themselves to deal with the very moment. And I remember working with someone that was, again, a victim of sexual assault. But I said, right, how would that have been different if the future version of you, the previous version of you, and the actual version of you were all there to deal with that moment differently? And of course, they're highly resourced. For one, they outnumber them 3-1. So it's already going to be a different dynamic. And then, it completely changes the memory, because effectively they've got this kind of enthusiasm of youth. They've got the person there that was quite vulnerable, but then they kind of re-experience the moment in a very different way. And you've got the future stuff that has probably thought about that moment in a very negative, unresourceful way. It gets to revisit exactly the same moment in a highly resourceful way, because they're now attacking it in different perspectives. So is it inner child work? Well, it depends when the moment in time is, but you're still bringing a youthful version before the moment comes into that moment. And in my experience, it definitely adds something unique, to timeline stuff. Rowan, I know you're quite knowledgeable on the kind of the principles of this kind of stuff. Is that just like timeline stuff, or is that something different?
It sounds like it is timeline, but you're just working both directions at the same time and in the present moment. One thing I was going to ask you, and anyone else as well that works with sort of timeline and inner child stuff, when you come across an event that you're wanting to work with, do you first of all look at the end of the event and ask the individual what the beliefs were that they created as a result of this experience?
Sometimes they know, sometimes they don't. But what I normally say is, if there is a block right now, and sometimes an idiomotor response, but I'll say, I want you to go back to the point where that was created. And if that is the point of trauma, well, then that's clear. And then you can always future pace in that moment and say, well, now that you have, taken the meaning of things as you want it to be, how now do you see the future? And effectively, that then creates a new timeline as they kind of want it to be. But yeah, asking the question in terms of what beliefs they have now that were created as a result of that thing, they don't always know it. Do you find that, Rowan?
I find that if you're going back to the actual events, if you take them and introduce them to their younger self and just walk through the memory as it was, effectively holding their younger self's hand and standing with them through it, or with anyone else that they might need. But before you actually do any change work or anything like that with it, if you then ask them what the beliefs were that they created as a result of this experience, you quite often get really, really simple beliefs. And I'll check and go, is there any other beliefs you've created? Is there any other beliefs? And I check that I've got all the beliefs that I can see at that point. And at that point, we then go in and do the work on the memory and let them make any changes or speak to anyone they want to speak to, or bring anyone else in that they want to bring in. And then I recheck the beliefs at the end and make sure that I've got a belief change. And every time I've had a belief change at that second point, I've had a massive change in their problem.
I like that, because it checks the ecology of the change, in terms of that. And yeah, I mean, I do that in terms of, and sometimes you're right, it's very simple, general, normally protective beliefs at that point. Yeah. Things like, all men are bad, or, people are evil, or you can't trust people, or things like that, which is very helpful, in a certain level, because it's designed to protect. But obviously it has an unintended consequence of normally causing all kinds of issues in different areas. Steve, I saw you unmuted yourself. What's your thoughts there?
Yeah, I just wanted to say Freddie Jacquin has got a wonderfully simplistic and actually very childlike approach to a lot of this. And I don't know if you're familiar with his blink and delete little protocol. He asks people, well, when do you imagine this behavior first started? And that's a really powerful question. When do you imagine? So not when did it happen? When did this first start? When do you imagine? And they sort of have a little bit of a think about it. And then he asks them to, the pre-frame, which he does before this, is if you want to delete something on your computer, you press the button to say delete, and then you get that little plate up afterwards saying, are you sure? And then you press the yes again, and then it's deleted. So that's the pre-frame. And then he says, right, well, go back to that time now. Go back and see your former self when you were starting that behavior or that pattern or whatever it is, and then blink to delete it, and then blink again to be sure. And I think that's a really, really nice approach.
I think it is a nice approach, but there is, I was working with someone recently that had a horrible childhood. But, I said to her, what positives came from that horrible childhood? And she said, you know what? I'm pretty tough. I can handle really tough situations. And I said, anything else? And she said, you know what? I don't take any shit, and all that. And she had a long list of things. So sometimes I think, I like it. It's quite a very simple, very elegant thing, but it doesn't necessarily identify. I think, that almost has like a binary element of the memory is bad, the memory is good. But, if you've seen the movie, The Butterfly Effect, Ashton Kutcher, awful film, great premise, but he goes back in time to kind of make bad events good. And in doing so, everything gets worse on virtually every occasion. And I think sometimes that's the paradox in doing time stuff, is that sometimes you can go to moments in the past, very well intentioned. And actually, if it is the case where the brain accepts, well, that thing just didn't happen. But what if there's a whole timeline of resourceful benefits that you got from that moment that you've just deleted in that moment? So I like it, but you've got to be very precise about what memories you're going to delete if you're going to do that. Whereas I tend to think, going back to a moment in the past and saying, well, look, take what's good and reframe what wasn't so useful and make it more useful. Well, that's only going to have two then positive timelines that kind of ripple out into the future. So, when I first came across some of the NLP techniques of, the kind of the classic change history and all that, kind of shrink it down and delete it like it's not happened. Well, sometimes like I think I'm a highly resourceful person now because I had some really shitty moments in my childhood and I had a really tough time as a teenager and as an early adult. It's kind of like, probably if those moments didn't happen, I wouldn't be the person I am now. So there is an element of, I think, a duty of care to say, right, and sometimes, let's be honest, there's shitty moments in the past that offer no real benefit, in which case, you can delete them, no harm done. But I do think, there is a potential element of, but what if we're losing something good there? Does that make sense, Steve?
Yeah, it does. I was talking more in terms of behaviors, patterns of behavior, rather than trying to delete an event, because I think there are very often those positives to be found. I was working with a lady earlier today, and she's had her mother's highly narcissistic, still alive. Her mother's in her 90s now, and she's having to care for her, and she's still domineering this woman's life. But just conversationally, this wasn't through hypnosis. She came to the understanding that because her mother was so harsh on her and so narcissistic and controlling, she's turned out to be a really, really good person herself, because it was kind of like the way she had to cope with it. So, and I sort of jokingly said to her, I said, well, maybe you've actually got something to thank your mum for there. And she said, I've never thought of it that way. And she just had this massive body shift. She just relaxed into that idea. It was a really powerful moment for her.
Sorry, go on, Rowan.
All right. I was just going to say, I think those things are really, it's really important to be able to do those reframes. And a lot of what we do as therapists is that reframe and putting a different shift on, a different perspective on it. And one of the ways I look at all of this sort of timeline work is from the view that all learning is state dependent. So I look at it like rungs on a ladder. So if we've got one side of the ladder is all our traumatic experience, and then the other side of the ladder is all of our sort of beneficial high resource state experience, and we're going back to one of the first rungs on the ladder where there's a separation between those two different states, and taking the resources from the good, beneficial, resourceful state by creating a shift in the memories of that inner child, we're effectively joining the ladders. We're joining the two sides of the ladder with a rung. And then when we step up and go back and watch the sort of ripple through the timeline as we go back, we can see how that access to those resources that's now been joined to this state at an early point in the timeline creates this ripple effect all the way through the timeline and cause shifts all the way through it. I think the idea of doing the click delete is a brilliant idea as well, but I think that should always be pre-framed with some questioning as to whether all of the parts within the individual are happy for this delete to happen, not just the conscious mind. So I think it should be more than just a sort of like a two-step click delete. I think it should be a check with the universal mind before the click delete happens as well, and make sure that there's nothing in that behavior, that experience that we don't want to keep. Did you have something as well?
I think that's a very important point. I think we need to do all those ecology checks. I mean, we're sort of talking a bit. Well, I am anyway, off the cuff here, and I think, yeah, thank you, Rowan, for bringing that up, because I think that's a very, very important point.
It's worth pointing out as well that, you know, remembering something is, you know, I don't know if you know the sort of the myth of Osiris, where he's remembered, he's put back together and remembered by Isis. And remembering is a putting back together, a reconstructing of stuff from the past, not a reproducing. So it's not reproductive, it's reconstructive. And as a result, any shifts and changes that we make, every time we remember a memory, we're actually remembering the last time we remembered the memory rather than remembering the original memory. So each time we remember it, if there's a little bit of difficulty, or if something's been suggested to us that's slightly different. I know they've done tests on this where they basically fed false information to people. I think there's one where a woman's handbag was supposedly stolen in a lecture hall or something like that. And they started making up, and the professor or doctor that was giving the lecture started agreeing with the fact that it was a checked shirt or something like that, and then saying with authority, you know, the person had a beard as well. And before long, everyone that witnessed the incident is reporting this person to have a beard and checked shirt and things like that. So we start to really shift and change what we believe to be the real event really, really quickly and really, really easily. So this takes us back to this idea that, you know, we can't actually know if anything before this point right now exists, or if we're just a brain in a jar. You know, it's a good stance to take on all this stuff, I think.
Yeah, totally. And I think with the inner child stuff, you know, is it actually your inner child? You know, is it actually the memory of you that you're talking to? Well, clearly not, but it's what your unconscious represents that to be. And I completely agree with you on that point in terms of memory. I actually witnessed a fight that led to a murder, and was you know, asked to kind of provide a witness statement. And I hadn't been to the pub where the fight took place in a bathroom, you know, in a pub. I witnessed the fight. I didn't witness anything else, but I went to the police station and they were asking me all the questions. What did you see? And I gave the statement as I remembered it. And then a few weeks later, I went to the same pub toilet and it was nothing as I described it in this witness statement. And I'm like, have I just, like, you know, made this stuff up in my head, or have I allowed this person to kind of, you know, get away with murder because my witness statement is so full of holes? But the truth is, you are reprocessing it as you think about it. And if someone would have asked me after I gave that statement, you know, is that actually how it was? I would have, you know, bet thousands. Yeah, that is totally how it was. There was 3 sinks. Got there was 2 sinks. The colors were different. The size was different. It was all different in my head than what I thought it would be. So when we go back to an inner child, it doesn't have to look like how you look like as a child. It doesn't have to have the same mannerisms, because it's a metaphorical representation of either you as a child or childlike qualities of you in a child. And if you see a wounded child or an upset child or an anxious child, then there's an opportunity that by helping the anxious child feel reassured or an unloved child be loved, well, actually, to use that metaphor that you've just used, Rowan, of a ripple effect throughout time, the whole point of this is so that they actually feel more resourceful and kind of better prepared in the present. So whether it's, just a model and a metaphor, doesn't really matter. The key thing is, do they make more of their situation in the present, and are they going to be more of who they want to be in the future? And as long as we get to that point, however you frame and phrase the inner child work, is it useful is pretty much what it comes down to. If you're listening in the audience right now and you think, actually, I've done lots of work with inner child work, raise your hand. It'd be good to hear your anecdotes. If you think it's bullshit, let us know as well. Like, raise your hand. Love to hear your thoughts on that. Let's kind of move the conversation on. Rowan, back to you.
Yeah, I think that ripple through time's an interesting one, because it's a really nice and easy way of just extending that out past the now and into the future and doing the future pace. And the way our memories actually work, we've got the sort of sensory information that goes in through the various different sensory modalities, and then there's a part of our mind called the central executive that connects all that together and connects it with the information that we already have within our mind. And that's the part that effectively puts it into long-term memory instead of short-term memory. So if we understand how to work with that and how to hack that central executive by using multiple modalities, then we can create those future memories. And also, the re-imprinting of previous experiences, real or imagined, with enough effectively magnetic energy, I suppose would be a good way of putting it, to be able to make it really stick. And then it becomes a real post-hypnotic suggestion, where anytime that's going to come up in the future, because we've built this extremely powerful future memory of this new state working, it gives us the ability to just have that come up in place of any previous behaviors. I think the idea of running it through, before I really started looking at and learning about the sort of the art of memory side of things, I would run through it with sort of 3 future paces. Now I always do 5. And that's specifically because if you repeat something or review something 5 times, it's more likely to be a powerful shift in the memory. That if you walk through a memory palace and drop things into different locations and then review it 5 times, it's stuck. So if you do that future pace 5 times as well, it sticks a lot more easily. So I think working with and understanding memory, if you're going to be working with inner child work or any timeline sort of stuff, I think it's important to sort of get a grasp of how memories sort of encoded and stored and recalled. I'm wondering as well, whether it's actually beneficial, instead of going for a sort of, a piece of timeline work where you don't know if the memory is real or imagined, just going directly for the imagined and making it into that fairy tale version, where you're obviously creating a sort of cartoon fairy tale construct of what could have caused this problem, rather than looking for what actually did cause this problem. And by doing that, you're effectively, with that pre-frame of making up a story rather than going into their own timeline. Is that a cleaner way of doing it? Is that a safer way of doing it? Possibly.
Yeah, I mean, I think using, whether it's kind of fairy tales or kind of metaphors and that kind of stuff, but I mean, if the frame is the memory isn't real, it's just your representation of what happened, I think that makes it become that kind of safe space anyway that you would find in a fairy tale or a story. But yeah, I find that, I mean, if we look at some of the trends and similarities, a lot of us talked about what you do with the inner child tends to have a ripple through time and affect the present. Well, that's a really good, useful thing then. And also what Steve was mentioning in terms of his 3 gifts and what I mentioned, giving a resource or a belief, that exchange of gifts or secrets, there does seem to be a very kind of reciprocal dynamic. You're not just kind of telling this inner child and projecting, as Willie was saying, right, inner child, here's more confidence, you need that. well, there's a presupposition and that they lack confidence, and then that kind of pans throughout their timeline. So that element of it being, you know, a discussion, a very much a two-way dynamic, and giving them what they need, not what you think they need, seems to be, you know, certain patterns that we've kind of seen there. Again, you know, we've heard a lot from Steve. So if anyone else in the audience, not that we don't like you up here, Steve, feel free to stay. But if anyone else does have something they want to share or ask, maybe you're a bit nervous to do inner child work, you're not sure how to kind of bring it into the into the conversation, feel free to raise your hand. We'll get you up on stage. And yeah, is there an ideal age, Rowan, that, you know, when you do inner child work, it tends to come up again and again? Are they about 9? Are they about 10? Are they 4? What's the age that tends to come up for you?
Yeah, I think with, you know, if we're looking at initial sensitizing events and the formation of the initial beliefs that then get sort of pegged onto at later stages throughout the development, it's a time that's referred to as the imprinting years. It tends to be 2 or 3 to sort of 9 or 10. And I find that if you can go back to that point, you'll probably get a profound shift and a profound change. I have had clients where I've taken them back there. And, you know, I think this is an important part as well. You know, if you do work with a memory, whether it's real or imagined, go back in a follow-up session and check that you've cleared everything. Because it may be that you're clearing something quite traumatic and there's other little bits that need to be worked on as well. So go back in a follow-up session and just make sure that you've done your work properly. You know, make sure there's nothing else there. I was dealing with a client with ADD, and he had, I've dealt with a few clients with ADD, and they seem to have this lack of safety in childhood where they have to keep an eye out for things. It may be an alcoholic parent, it may be an absent parent, it may be abuse, it may be all sorts of different things. This guy had a couple of instances in his childhood where he wasn't feeling strong. And one incident where he was actually taken out of his bed while he was asleep by one of his mother's partners, sort of looking to see whether his father was back on the scene. So quite traumatic for the boy. And, you know, we got him to a point where he was able to focus and stay focused while he was driving, which was one of his problems with his ADD. It was that bad that he was losing focus while he was driving and sort of drifting off the road and things like that. So we got him so he was safe to drive. But there was still a problem. And then we took him back and looked at the memories again. And I just asked him, you know, is there anywhere earlier that you need to go to look at this? And suddenly he was on a battlefield. And I was like, okay, this is a weird one. And this was one of my first experiences of working with a supposed past life regression. And it was just a spontaneous regression. And, you know, his mind came up with this battle scene where he was in a small battalion and there was this huge army that they were fighting. So he wasn't strong enough and he had to try and protect everyone and keep his wits about him because he was the leader of this battalion. And we cleared that and he's not had to come back. So, you know, I think whether these past life things that tend to come up occasionally, or, you know, some people actually go for that. And I don't know if that's necessarily because there's, you know, if you're there for past life therapy, there's a presupposition that there is a past life. So that just opens up the possibility for the mind to construct these things. But I think if we come across them, you know, they tend to be extremely interesting, and the amount of detail that people can produce for these things, you know, it was quite clear from his description that, you know, we were talking about the First World War, not the Second World War and things like that. And so I sort of asked him afterwards, you know, where do you think you were? And he was like, well, I think I was in the First World War. It's quite interesting, but it's funny what comes up.
It is fascinating, the level of detail, you know, not just in, you know, perceived past life regression, but even if you did create that kind of fairy tale story and said, right, you're in a castle, you know, they'll be able to tell you the color of the bricks, you know, if there's a unicorn walking by, you know, all that kind of stuff. So I think sometimes we, you know, underestimate the ability for the power of the imagination to kind of fill in all those gaps, and that element of incompleteness. So if you say, you know, there's a child there and it's got something to share, guess what? It's going to have something to share, you know, and it will just do that. And that's the great thing about suggestion. I think although the intention was to take this to 10:30, I think we've got a few shy people in the audience. So if we are going to keep it to 10:30, please raise your hand if you've got something you really want to share or ask. Otherwise, we might just kind of wind this up at 10 o'clock, which used to be the average length of it anyway. Just so we're not kind of just me, Rowan, and Steve kind of talking about our experiences of inner child work. But I would say I mean I love it. I'm a big fan of inner child. I mean the topic of the room today, can hypnosis heal your inner child? At some level does, of course, have a presupposition that the inner child needs healing. At some level, you know, if we label healing as just kind of giving the inner child whatever it needs most, then yeah, I feel like it can do that, because the inner child is only going to be a representation of what your mind perceives to be the inner child. And if it perceives it to be in need of something and you can meet that need, there is going to be some element of perceived reconciliation or kind of something like that then ripples through, which I think is fascinating. But at the same time, I don't think it's just about what we can do for the inner child, but sometimes it's what the inner child can do for us. So I think that's equally important here. I love the fact that I've created a bit of fear of loss of this session. We've now got a couple of people on the stage. Willie, what did you want to add?
Well, actually, I had a question on inner child work. Do y'all ever find yourself going back and using the inner child techniques to work on yourself? I found myself doing that a lot in the past, and just to do self-hypnosis, which all hypnosis is self-hypnosis anyway. But just to use the inner child work on myself, it works for me anyway. What do you guys think about it?
I do this as well, Willie, and like what I've found is that in most cases I can do it fine, but in some memories, and it tends to be the ones that I really need to work with, I tend to knock myself out of trance by trying to deal with it, because you really need to have the sort of the adult mind and the child mind interacting, and you need to be keeping track of what's happened and what you need to do. So you need this sort of trinity split within the mind instead of a duality split within the mind, and that can be extremely hard to maintain yourself. It's hard to guide and observe and be observed, if that makes sense. I don't know what your thoughts are here, Adam.
I agree with that. And I think, you know, we mentioned, you know, the kind of temporal pincer movement as kind of a metaphor there. I mean, that would be impossible to do it on yourself, because then you've got, you know, several moving parts, and you're the person being the, you know, the almost like the characters and the, you know, the conductor of the orchestra itself. I mean, that would be very tricky to do. Which is why, I mean, it sounds really, you know, pretentious and kind of arrogant, but I listen to a lot of my own recordings, because that way I can then hear my voice leading it, but then actually not have to worry about what I'm going to say, just kind of listen to it and kind of experience it that way. So I think when I do inner child work on my stuff, I tend to dig out some recordings of inner child work with other people, knowing that I can then use that as a loose structure. And my pre-frame to myself before I listen to any recordings like that is that it doesn't have to fit me perfectly. I'm just going to take what's useful and disregard what isn't. And then that enables me to kind of get the best of both worlds. But I think also there is an element of embracing the tough times of childhood without trying to make them better. And I was on a podcast once where the host said, if you could go back to any moment in your life and re-experience a day, which day would you do? And, you know, I think he was expecting me to say, right, the birth of my children or some kind of down a beach or something like that. And, you know, for those people that know a bit about my story, there was a time when I was 19 years old that I was a recluse filled with anxiety, wouldn't leave my room, at the very darkest, you know, considered, you know, suicide by jumping off my roof head first on the concrete. And I said to him, I want to go back to that day, because if I go back to that day and experience that for one day, the darkness of it, the grimness of it, the hopelessness of it, when I come back to my normal life, every day is a fucking paradise compared to that place. And sometimes I feel like we really need to realize how valuable sometimes tough, brutal moments are in our past, to realize how grateful we can be in the present. And sometimes I think we need to stop necessarily fixing things and just kind of appreciate that this is just a part of our life. And sometimes, you know, the idea that anyone that didn't have a perfect childhood is fundamentally broken and damaged and never can, have a meaningful life. How disempowering is that? What a hopeless way of thinking. I think a much more empowering way of thinking about it is that all of us have had shitty childhoods. All of us have had bad moments in our life. And you know what? We can recover from that even stronger than we were before. And I think that's such a more motivating and empowering way of thinking about it. But totally, Willie, I definitely do inner child work myself. But I agree with Rowan. It's very difficult to do it on yourself unless you don't have a recording. AK, welcome up on the stage. Did you have a question or something you wanted to share?
Yeah. Can you hear me properly?
We can, yeah. You're coming through loud and clear.
Yeah, thank you very much. So my mother has some some diseases like Brett's disease and some diabetes and something. And once I asked them to get some kind of healing, she was afraid in the first session, and she said, no, I cannot do it because she's already 60 plus. So in that situation, even if I know that there was something in the past of my mother, there are some bad memories or something, how to go about the healing process and this inner child, whatever things are there, because I did it for myself. I know the benefits, but if the person is having those kind of doubts that those memories are very horrifying and I cannot even recall, I don't want to, because in the night I will get those dreams the next day. So how to go about it at a senior age, and how to take it forward from here? This is my question.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
No, thanks for asking that question, AK. And for me, I've probably got a very different, answer to this than Rowan, but for me, inciting the motivational change and actually getting that person to the point of threshold where they want to do that thing is crucial. Because I mean, just to share a little bit, my mother is an alcoholic. And I think one of the main reasons, because when she gets very drunk, she gets all teary and she talks about, in very loose language, things that happened in her childhood, that is the reason why, she's drinking now and she's kind of damaged now. And fundamentally, she doesn't want to go back to that, those moments. She doesn't want to fix things. She's at some level accepting that, because for some people, we can't project our own values and our own models of the world on other people. And some people, there is the secondary gain that actually, yeah, if a bad thing happened, but it gives you permission to feel sorry for yourself or have a particular identity that you're locked into, that you've built so much of your life around. Who are we to change anyone? It's only for them. And a lot of my family know what I do. So if they reach the point where they didn't want to have those things, they know that they can come to me and I can work with them. And the fact that some of them aren't asking me, what kind of a dick would I be to kind of go to them and say, I have the ability to make you better. That just sounds such a dickish thing to do. So I wouldn't want to do that, but equally I'm there for them if they ever request that. So I think, without knowing too much about your situation, AK, if you found it beneficial for you, then, let her know that and let her know that, these things are positive. But what you're actually doing is you're inciting the motivational change for her to want to then inquire more about it and say, oh, do you reckon you could do some of that stuff with me? But I think at the moment that you try and change someone that fundamentally doesn't want to be changed, it's going to be frustrating for you and resented by the person that you're working with is my take on it. I don't know if you've got any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing. If someone doesn't want to go back and look at those memories, we shouldn't be trying to force them to do that. I think that's fundamentally wrong. If at some point in the future they do decide to open up and want to look at those memories, that's fine. If you know exactly what those memories are, you could come up with a metaphor or some story that would allow a change that would potentially be enough to help her. I think that's one way you could work with it. My mother was also, she was a cider drinker. She only drank cider. And I asked her one day when she was craving a drink, because my brother had stopped letting her have her can of cider because she was terribly arthritic in the last few years of her life. And my brother had sort of stopped her having these drinks. And one day when she was pining for a cider, I just asked her, what was your first happy memory? And she was like, oh, it was making cider with my sister and my father in the garden. And I was like, was that dry cider? Because she only ever drank dry cider. She wouldn't drink anything except for like really dry cider. So it had to Merry Down Dry or Strongbow Dry or whatever. And it was dry cider that they used to make. So her addiction for alcohol was nothing to do with any trauma or anything like that. It was actually her trying to get back to this happy family memory of her family being this unit that was doing something that they all enjoyed and having fun. So rather than a problem, which is, like most people, when I look at alcoholics, it tends to be someone trying to avoid some sort of pain in their life rather than trying to find some joy and happiness within a memory or within their life, especially. And the more she was crippled by her disease and, after losing my father and things like that, the drinking got worse. And that was her trying to get that family unit back together and trying to feel that happiness. So we can't make an assumption either about, this problem being to do with a trauma or something like that. We have to look at it from both possibilities. So I think, AK, if your mum's not wanting to look at these memories, and if she knows what the memories are and it's too painful for her to look at them, don't traumatize her more when she's in the later years of her life. I think there's a certain point where our body gets to a level where it's not going to be able to heal itself so much. I do believe that all or almost all disease in the body has a psychological element, because psycho, the mind, affects some of the body. Everything that you do, every process in your body, every neurochemical that's released and absorbed and cleansed from your synapses and everything is all done by the mind. So everything has a psychological element to it. And I think that there's a lot of, evidence with things like German new medicine that specific types of trauma can lead to specific types of disease. But there's a point where that disease may have progressed so far that the body just won't be able to heal itself. And at that point, comfort and compassion and care are possibly a better way of behaving and dealing with that situation.
I also think, AK, one of the things that I tried when I was trying to get my own mum to, be receptive to working, I used a metaphor of, can you imagine, being related to an excellent plumber, and you figured out that actually there's a few leaks in your home, and there's this person that is qualified uniquely to fix leaks, and they really want to help, but the person is actually in their home surrounded by leaks, and actually the dampness is causing lots of problems and that kind of stuff. And yet, can you imagine how frustrated that plumber would be that the person is in a damp house surrounded by leaks, and that's damaging the property, and they don't ask them for help, and even, that's a fairly obvious metaphor. She didn't take the bait. She was not interested. So if someone is not willing to kind of request that kind of work, then I think you've got to respect their wishes at some level. And I know it's frustrating because I'm in the same situation, like I know it's, you feel uniquely positioned to help them. And yet if they're reluctant to it, as hard as it is, I think you just have to respect that. Does that make sense, AK? Are you still there, AK? We see your mic's turning on, but I can't hear you. I think we're getting a bad signal from. I hope, AK, if your mic works again, feel free to unmute yourself and start talking. We can kind of hear your points there. Steve, do you have any examples of the challenge of wanting to work with someone, but they're not receptive to working with you?
Yeah, I think. Is it better now? Can I?
AK, you're back. You are back. So let's listen to AK first, and we'll jump to you, Steve.
So my point is, she knows that whatever breathing problem is there, she is not interested to take the medicines and all. And someone told that there will be benefits if she does this healing strategy, because this is something she don't want to have. And there are side effects. Once you have one disease, you will get some more diseases in your elder age. So she knows there will be some benefits, but she is not able to deal with the kind of memories which she recalled after the first session. In the night, she got some kind of some dreams, that horrifying dreams. So she was thinking that I will not conduct a second session of healing, or in that case. So little bit of motivation, or maybe some approach how to progress, because there is benefit she knows, and there is a consequence also she knows. So how to take it forward from here?
I think because she's had that experience, AK, of having horrifying dreams, that's going to be very traumatic. So I think sometimes you might need to future pace and say, you know, look, you know, and I would try and find a metaphor that, you know, if you're resetting a broken bone, well, look, it's going to get more painful before it gets better. And I think you need that element to kind of, so that when she's having, let's say, you know, because when you bring something like repressed memories, you bring them back to the surface, yeah, they're traumatic to deal with. You know, easier if it's done in a disassociated way and you know, guided in a particular way. But if they're just coming up and she finds them really traumatic, then the number one strategy that, in my experience at least, that people deal with something unpleasant, whether that's anxiety or sadness or whatever it might be, is avoidance. They just want to avoid that thing. After that, if they can't avoid it, they tend to self-medicate. And that's where a lot of addictions come from. So my thoughts are, if she's encountered, you know, effectively an abreaction, not within the therapy, but within the dreams that follow the therapy, some kind of metaphor or reassurance that actually this is all part of the process and it might get a bit worse before it gets a lot better, might be useful. Rowan, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I would just add in that, you know, quite often you'll find that those dreams do appear, but that they're just for the first couple of nights, you know, as the mind starts to uncover and unlock these things. And one of the things that can be really beneficial for this sort of thing, if there is obviously conscious awareness of what's happened and a sort of spike in the pain, is, first of all, you know, how long have you been dealing with this pain? How long has this been causing a problem in your life? And if you were to combine all of that time and all of that pain for the last however many years and compare that to looking at it face on for one session or two sessions, which one's the more painful? And working with something like that, I think, is a really good lever to get them to actually do the work. The thing is, if something's been uncovered and she's having those memories, those dreams, then, you know, that means it's up into the conscious mind. So it needs to be either finished and cleaned up or put to bed. And, you know, it'll slowly fade back into the unconscious, I suppose, as time goes on, depending on how good her memory is. But, you know, if she's been re-traumatized by these dreams, then it's maybe, you know, the lid's off the tin, so to speak, so far.
So hopefully that's helpful, AK, in terms of a couple of strategies or phrases that you can use there. Steve, you were about to say something before AK found his audio again.
Yeah, I do a lot of pro bono work with parents who are going through what's called parental alienation. And just as put a very quick description on this, very often after a separation or a divorce, a child will align with the resident parents and starts to reject or alienate the other parent. And this can go so far as confabulation of things that the alienated parent has supposedly done. And sometimes these accusations can be quite extreme. And so I do that on a pro bono basis. But a few months ago, I had somebody in the chair who was an adult who had actually alienated his own father when he was a child. And he did not want to go back to any of that. And I wasn't trying to push it, obviously. But he was extremely uncomfortable at any notion of going back. Very, very conflicted individual, because I think he knew that these things he'd said that his father had done, and these accusations, which actually landed his father in prison, but that's another story. He knows he's impacted his father's life. He knows he's impacted his own life, and he didn't want to go back at all. And I think we were talking earlier on about the crossover, perhaps, between timeline and inner child work. And I think it might be useful, as well as that crossover, it might be useful to draw some distinction. And I was just scribbling some notes down here. And can we agree, I mean, just putting this as a proposition, that timeline is when we take somebody back, we run the event through with them with resource states, we run everybody else through with resource states to change that perception of that memory, if you like. Whereas within a child work, we run it through as it is or as it was, but with the support from their older self. And is that distinction? First of all, do you agree with that distinction, and do you think that might be useful?
I can see Rowan nodding his head here. I think he certainly agrees with you. I think for me, sometimes I'll do inner child work without the necessity to even run anything forward or backwards. You just visit your inner child and you figure out what they need. And sometimes that's just to listen, or a hug or a conversation. So it's not that you then need to go through a particular event as it was. I think whenever you're dealing with an event and the ripple effect of that, you can call it timeline, stuff, even if there is, whether it's an inner child or just a younger version of you in adulthood. It doesn't even have to be a child. Whereas inner child stuff doesn't need to involve a timeline at all. If you create some kind of safe space to visit, a child version, and this is why, the early inner child stuff that I was doing wasn't visiting a memory at all. It was just like, you're in a place that children love, and sometimes it's a garden with a paddling pool, and sometimes it's a park with a roundabout, and hey, your inner child's turned up. Let's have a listen, let's reconnect. And therefore there is no real timeline ripple effect designed to do that. But if you have met that child's needs, or if you've had a better, effectively in many ways, if we say that the inner child is just a representation of an unconscious part, you could say it's parts integration therapy, but called inner child work. It just happens to be a childlike quality, and let's be honest, virtually all of these 50 to 150 parts are going to be created in that kind of, key, childhood, kind of period. And they're not going to be created after that unless there's like really traumatic, necessity to do that. So, does it need to be timeline? No, it could just be a form of parts integration or kind of even direct suggestion, give that inner child something that it needs. And then the consequence of that is that you feel more resourceful in the present, because if we look at past life regression, if we accept that you didn't actually have a past life, sometimes I think that's just a metaphor to deal with something that you either don't know the details of or aren't willing to address in your lifetime. You resolve something on the battlefield in World War I, and then that somehow makes you feel more empowered in the future. Same thing could easily be the case with inner child work. You see a wounded, upset, frustrated or sad child, you make that child happy, and you feel like you've got that kind of better communication. Well, at some level, that could help you resolve an issue that you've got in the present without needing any timeline stuff. But I appreciate the distinction there between timeline stuff and if you were just going back to a memory of a child, and having that, without trying to change things, but just kind of be there as a resource state, how that would be different. I just think you can do inner child work without any timeline stuff at all.
I agree there. I think that distinction you made there, Steve, is quite spot on. But as Adam says, there's this ability to be able to just communicate with that child. You don't need to go to the event. You can, you could ask your client at what time or what age do you think this started, and then just see that version of yourself and send in the resources or something along those lines. But I think it's important to note as well that effectively when we're children, we play games, and we're very good at learning when we're playing. And the adults in our life, or society in general, tells us we need to decide what we want to be when we grow up. And at that point, we start to form an idea as to what we're going to be as an adult. What job do we want? We're told that we need to do this by our careers advisors at school and things like that. So we pick a game that we're going to learn so well that we can do that and earn money doing it and support ourselves doing it. But we're playing a game. And really, every one of us, even up to the age of 95, 100, whatever it is, the day you're on your deathbed, that inner child is still there. It's wearing a mask. It's pretending to play a game. It's done a fantastic job of contributing to society, hopefully, and advancing that game for anyone that comes along to play the game of being a scientist or a doctor or whatever it happens to be at a later stage after you've been and gone. But the core of you is always that inner child. So I think really, if we look at it in that respect, we're always working with the inner child. We're always trying to remove the suggestions and the shields that we've created to try and protect our vulnerability that we don't actually need in the first place. We are complete, perfect human beings. We're complete, perfect consciousnesses. And it's this, it might be one of the things that I came across was when I was working with myself. I'd been bullied by a kid at school in primary school and teased for liking a girl in my class. And I'd gone all bravado and gone, no, I don't like her. And that had been a point where I'd created a part of my shield. That's a point where I'd created part of this mask. And by removing that mask, my inner child was able to come out just that little bit more on a daily basis in my adult life now. And I think, that's part of what we're working with as well. So anything that we're doing where we're removing part of that false persona mask that we put on for protection is really inner child work as far as I'm concerned. But I do think that what you're saying there about, when we're looking at the memories and walking through them, that would be sort of the traditional idea of inner child just walking through it with support, like Freddie Jackman does, where you're sort of taking your younger self over the shoulder and walking them through the memory. And then when we go in and start to do the work and change it and use all the different strategies and things like that and allow them to make the changes they want to make and change the beliefs that they want to change and then seeing that echo through the timeline, that's timeline therapy. But it's also causing a ripple where the inner child is allowed to release itself a little bit more through all of those different events from that point in time up to this point and into the future. Does that make sense, Steve?
Yeah, it does. That's, as I say, I've not done a lot of what I would call inner child work. So this is a fascinating subject, fascinating talk for me. And in fact, I just want to take this opportunity to thank you guys for hosting these clubhouses, because I think I'm learning more from these clubhouses than I've learned in a lot of other places. And I would encourage anybody else there in the audience to come forward and say their bit as well. You don't want to be hearing me all the time. But these sessions you do are just absolutely amazing. Thank you very much, all of you, for running them.
I would like having you here and just make our heads explode slowly.
Yeah, I mean, this is classic ego strengthening, Steve. You've done a fantastic job there. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
And we're coming to the end. It has whizzed by. I'm so glad actually that we extended this for an extra half an hour. I thought we might have an early finish today, but thanks Willie, thanks AK for joining us back up on the stage to share a few questions and thoughts. I agree with Steve. I think it has been a really fascinating conversation about inner child work, and I think it is something that gets kind of put in the same category as kind of a bit of the woo-woo stuff, like, oh, you've got, it's seen as a bit hippie-ish. But the reality is that what happened in our childhood at some level is, we're dealing with the echoes, the ripples of our childhood experiences now. And therefore, if we use this element, you can't actually, and this is a phrase I use a lot when I'm working with clients, we can't actually change the past, but we can change how we think about the past. And as we change how we think about the past, if that then makes us more, empowered, more, kind of resourceful in the present, then it's a very good thing to do. So I think if you are in the audience and you don't do much inner child work, start doing it, the thing I love about inner child work as well, it doesn't have to be done in a structured, hypnotherapy session. Ask your friends and family member about, their favorite memory from childhood And guess what? Their childhood ego state is going to come straight into the executive, and you can have a little conversation with their inner child. What was their favorite toy when they grew up? Things like that. So this is the kind of stuff you can play with, as we should do. And I think, if we can access the playful part of our inner child into the present, we're all going to be happier for it. That's my quick summary. Rowan, over to you to summarize.
Yeah, I think you've pretty much covered it. The only thing that's popping into my head is the words of the late, great Milton H. Erickson, which is, it's never too late to have a happy childhood. And I think that's a wonderful way of looking at it all.
I'm hoping it wasn't just me that got chills down the back of my neck when I heard that quote there. That's very profound. I've had a shift in my unconscious there, definitely from that. So yeah, let's all improve our childhoods, no matter how old you are. Thank you everyone for joining us today on today's Clubhouse Room. We'll be back next Thursday. We're not sure on the topic yet, but we'll share it on the socials and that kind of stuff. And today's session wasn't just kind of live on Clubhouse. It was also recorded for YouTube. So if you are interested in seeing this, maybe you've joined at the end and you've missed some of the bits. If you check out Adam Cox Hypnotist on YouTube, you'll be able to track this down, or it's going to be the same title. It's streaming live on YouTube now. So Can Hypnosis Heal Your Inner Child? If you put that in YouTube, you'll find this and you'll be able to watch some of the bits that you've missed. Equally, if you've got any suggestions for any future topics of rooms that we're hosting, or if you think that you're an expert on a particular area that we haven't covered, you want to co-host, let us know. Easiest way to do that, if you click our pictures, follow us on Instagram, send us a direct message, is probably the easiest way of doing it. Or I think there is like a little message, like a paper plane kind of icon there that you can kind of message us there. But either way, let us know. We want to make these rooms useful and beneficial for you. And to do that, let us know what you want to talk about or hear about, and we can then steer that in that direction. But thanks again from me. Lovely to have you all on here. Thanks to everyone, particularly Willie, Steve, and Aiko that joined us up on the stage. Really appreciate that. And thanks to Rowan. We did an excellent job co-hosting even without Graham today.
Yeah, I wonder if he'll listen back to the recording and see how well we did without him.
We did excellent, Rowan. High five. So thank you everyone for joining, and we'll see you next week.
Yep, thanks everyone.